Week 4, Module 4. And today we're going to return to discussing one of the civilizations of the archaeological region known as the Fertile Crescent. But whereas last week we discussed the various kingdoms or civilizations that make up Mesopotamia, that fluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates River, we're going to swing around and we're going to consider some of the major types of art and architecture that survive from ancient Egypt. So let's get started. Now, the Nile River was absolutely fundamental to the viability of Egyptian civilization, and you can see it here. And there's a green swath on either side of the Nile River, and that's because the Nile River was absolutely fundamental to the viability of cereal agriculture or seasonal agriculture that sustained ancient Egyptian civilization. Annually, the river would flood its banks for several miles, rendering a highly fertile strip of land. And this is why much of Egyptian imagery, especially hunting scenes, show marshy areas with reeds and water creatures that captures this annual period of abundance, and upon which the entirety of ancient Egyptian civilization was so dependent. Now, one thing that's interesting about the Nile River is that it runs northward. The origin of the Nile River is actually below this screen, further south in Central Africa. And the river runs northwards and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. For this reason, when scholars discuss ancient Egypt, it is sometimes divided into two areas, Upper and Lower Egypt. What can confuse students is that Upper Egypt on a map appears on the lower portion of the screen, while Lower Egypt appears in the higher portion of the screen. And it's very often that students feel like these two terms should be flipped. And the reason that they're identified this way is because Upper Egypt has nothing to do with the verticality of your screen. Upper Egypt refers to the area of ancient Egyptian civilization that is further up the Nile, closer to its source in Central Africa, while Lower Egypt refers to the region of ancient Egyptian civilization that is closer to the river basin that empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And so because the water is running in this direction, that's why upper is here and lower is there, just to clarify any confusion. So, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt refers to the area of ancient Egyptian civilization that is further up the Nile, closer to its source in Central Africa, while Lower Egypt refers to the region of ancient Egyptian civilization that is closer to the river basin that empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And so because the water is running in this direction, that's why upper is here and lower is there, just to clarify any confusion. So, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now, one of the earliest and most important Egyptian artifacts is this. I'm showing you both sides of an object that's carved bilaterally on both sides, and it's called the Palette of Narmer. And the Palette of Narmer was found in the Temple of Horus in the city of Heracleopolis, and it dates to about 2950 BCE. and it's carved from green schist, which is a type of stone. As the name suggests, the palette of Narmer is a flat, double-sided palette covered with scenes carved in low relief and divided into registers. It's actually almost 2 feet tall, so much bigger than this image might suggest, meaning that it's a monumental form of an everyday domestic object. The palette of Narmer is a monumental, oversized form of a sort of handheld palette that would have been used in a domestic context to grind and prepare coal. Not the coal that you put in a fireplace, but Kohl. Coal in ancient Egypt was usually ground from the material stibnite. And coal was the makeup applied around the eye, that dark makeup that a lot of people actually assume is charcoal, that was applied around the eye, both to protect the eye against illnesses, but in day-to-day life to reduce the glare of the sun. The oversized dimensions of this palette clearly indicate that it served a ceremonial and perhaps a religious function, meaning that it very probably served a votive function because it was positioned inside the temple of Horus and may have been, in one sense, placed in that temple as an offering to that Egyptian god on behalf of the person who commissioned it, which would be King Narmer himself. But of course, through the positioning or erection of the palette in the temple, particularly something, a relatively elaborate carving and of that size, it would also have added to the esteem of the king, even if the only people who could enter the temple were the priestly caste and the king or pharaoh himself. Now again, the Narmer palette dates to 2950 BCE, and that's a very important date, even though it might seem random. It isn't. It's around this time that ancient Egypt became a consolidated state. That is, that the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, which were previously divided, became unified through military action under one ruler. So according to Egyptian legend, the land of Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, and a powerful ruler named Menes from Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt and merged the two lands into a single kingdom. Menes is spelled M-E-N-E-S. Menes. The legendary king god Menes may have been the actual ruler Narmer. Many scholars believe this to be the case. And so the palette of Narmer is so significant because if we were to decode the composition, which we will in a moment, we can see that it marks the political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and it names Narmer as the king or pharaoh who achieved this. There are some fragments of Egyptian papyri, of Egyptian texts, that refer to the earliest Egyptian history, and they tell legends, and one of those legends is the legend of Menes, M-E-N-E-S. So scholars believe that the god Menes, described in these fragmented texts, was actually the historical figure Narmer. The reason that there is a sort of hypothesis about this is that the date 2950 not only marks the political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, under Menes/Narmer, but it's also essentially the beginning of written history of ancient Egypt. There's very little written text at all before this date. So the iconography, or the imagery on this palette, coincides with the development of a written tradition beginning in the same year, well, around the same time, 2950 BCE. I'm not sure if your textbook uses this term, but it may describe Narmer as a king from the pre-dynastic period. And the pre-dynastic period simply means before the pharaohs were established, like the earliest history of Egypt, because not only is Narmer recognized as the unifier, he is also recognized or considered to be the first pharaoh of Egypt. And the
Pharaoh. Pharaoh.
pharaoh or king of Egypt is an office that is sustained for millennia, for thousands of years. Same time, 2950 BCE/Narmer. But it's also essentially the beginning of written history of ancient Egypt. There's very little written text at all before this date. So the iconography, or the imagery on this palette, coincides with the development of a written tradition beginning in the same year, well, around the same time, 2950 BCE. I'm not sure if your textbook uses this term, but it may describe Narmer as a king from the pre-dynastic period. And the pre-dynastic period simply means before the pharaohs were established, like the earliest history of Egypt, because not only is Narmer recognized as the unifier, he is also recognized or considered to be the first pharaoh of Egypt. And the pharaoh or king of Egypt is an office that is sustained for millennia, for thousands of years, descending from Narmer. So let's take a quick look at both sides of the palette. Technically, I know that this side looks like it should be the front of the object because of the size of the main figure. If you wanted to be specific, this side should be the front because it contains this depression where coal would be mixed to create the eye makeup if this was actually a domestic object. So some people say that this is the front, and some people say that this is the front. That's why I'm just going to use the term sides. So let's look at this side. Okay. King Narmer clearly dominates this side of the palette. And we can see that the surface of the palette is divided into approximately 3 registers. One here, one here, and then this lower portion. In the uppermost portion of the palette, we see some symbols. At the very top, we have, to the left and right, what looks like the heads of cows. And these are actually representations of a goddess. Some say they represent the goddess Hathor. Some people say that these animal heads, these cows, represent the goddess Bat. There's a little bit of debate there. In the middle, we see something very important. It looks like a little rectangular box. But if you were able to zoom in or look very closely, it is actually a hieroglyph that names Narmer. There is a very small horizontal fish that at this time in Egyptian makes the sound Nar. Below that, there is a small vertical chisel. It looks like a vertical triangle or like a carrot. Like a carrot. It's not a carrot, it's a chisel. And that hieroglyph, that pictographic image, stands for the sound mer. So that little rectangular box identifies this palette as being of Narmer or depicting Narmer. It says Narmer. If we go to the central register, King Narmer is the largest figure according to hieratic scale, and he is shown raising a club or mace while he grips the scalp of his opponent, who kneels in submission. This is clearly an act of imminent violence that shows Narmer subjugating his enemy and victorious over his enemy. Again, hieratic scale has been used to depict Narmer because, what is that? What's hieratic scale? It's when the largest figure in the composition is the most important figure in that composition. So he's depicted according to hieratic scale, and he's also depicted according to composite view. He is also shown barefoot, a convention that communicates Narmer's semi-divine or fully divine nature. And we have a little attendant here who stands on his own little ground line. That is his faithful sandal bearer. His entire job is to walk behind Narmer holding his sandals. Narmer also wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. The white crown, I know some people says looks like a bowling pin. I don't think bowling existed in ancient Egypt, but if it did, I'm sure that the crown was not intended to refer to that. But this is the white crown of Upper Egypt. We can also see that he wears a beard here, and he wears a type of kilt. It's a piece of cloth strung around his waist, and kilt is technically a Scottish term. I don't know what your textbook uses, but the actual term for this in ancient Egypt is shundite. So his clothing is the shundite. In addition to that, he has a bull's tail affixed to his waistband. To the right, watching this scene, we have another representation of a god, this time the god Horus, the god in whose temple this palette was erected. And Horus is shown in the form of a hawk, potentially a falcon, but I think it's a hawk given its size, with a human arm and hand. And Horus holds a rope tied around the neck of this head, which is clearly that of an enemy. And the head of the enemy is emerging from a bunch of marshy reeds. So this is clearly a zoomorphic or animal form of the god Horus, and this little vignette within the overall composition reinforces the theme of victory and dominance. In the lowest register, we see two figures, and it's unclear whether they are running away from Narmer and his armies, or whether they are actually sprawled on the ground, having already been killed. So there are two ways to interpret that register. If we are to place this side of the Palette of Narmer side by side with the fragmented stelae of the Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin, you can see an evident continuity in the depiction of figures across vast geographical regions. There's about 700 years, roughly, that separate these two works, and they're from different types of objects. But again, we can see hieratic scale, we can see composite view, and we can see low and slightly higher relief, as well as the use of registers. And this signifies sort of commonality or some components that are shared across these two massive civilizations, even though they are geographically very far apart in their location. But there still would have been intercommunication between these two civilizations. There still would have been trade between the various kingdoms of Mesopotamia and that of ancient Egypt, and so on. And so that is captured, that relationship, in their pictorial vocabulary. Not everything is the same, but they have some shared strategies. On the other side, we have 4 registers. And in the upper register, we have a repetition. We have the heads of a cow in the upper left and right, again representing either the goddess Hathor or the goddess Bat. And we have the repetition of the hieroglyph that spells out Narmer's name through the horizontal fish and the vertical chisel that sound out Nor and Mer through pictographs. This register is the only one that tells a brief narrative, and the activity occurs from left to right. Here we can see Narmer walking barefoot with his loyal standard bearer carrying his sandals behind him. He is again shown using hieratic scale and composite view because he's clearly double the height of anyone in this procession. Narmer wears a different crown. He wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. It's slightly pointier and it has this curling element in the front. And Narmer's arrival is heralded by a series of standard bearers. This is clearly a procession, and they're carrying military standards, essentially, flags or other emblems that announce the king's arrival. And the procession is moving towards the right so that Narmer can inspect the decapitated bodies of his enemies. Again, in a really brutal but instantaneous way, telling the viewer that he is victorious and mighty. The deceased bodies of the enemy have been arranged in 2 vertical stacks of figures, which is the way that the artist tried to depict the fact that they were laying horizontally. In this lower third, we have an allegorical or symbolic representation of power using zoomorphic or animal imagery. Here we have two attendants who hold these mighty animals at bay using a leash. A leash sounds actually too fragile, like a leash could snap. I'm sure it's intended to be like a very, very strong chain. And the animals are actually a mythical animal known in ancient Egypt as cephalopods. And this mythical creature has the body of a leopard with the elongated neck of a serpent. And they look sort of lion-like at the very top. So here we have two cephalopods facing each other, and their long necks that are held in abeyance, that are held tight by the attendants, intertwine around the depression where the coal would be mixed if this was an actual domestic object. The intertwining of the necks of these incredibly powerful mythical beasts is obviously a strategy of, again, communicating the consequence of Narmer's military victory, which is the unification of these two ferocious kingdoms, Lower and Upper Egypt, fused under the rule of one person. In the lowermost register, we have a nude figure who cowers under a bull with a fortress or a palace visible in the background. There's a little platform and then a curving line, and this curving line represents like an outer wall of a city. Known for its strength and virility, the bull is another way of symbolizing the power and might of the king. And remember, on the other side, a bull's tail is attached to the waistband of his shundite. Known for its strength and virility, the bull is another way of symbolizing the power and might of the king. And remember, on the other side, a bull's tail is attached to the waistband of his shundite. So, collectively, this palette displays certain artistic conventions that, as we'll see, remain relatively constant throughout the duration of Egyptian art across millennia. And to a certain degree, the longevity of the pharaonic system that's instigated after Narmer means that in official Egyptian art that serves the pharaoh, many of the artistic conventions do not change. They remain constant over a very long period of time. Moving onwards, much of Egyptian art that survives is funerary in nature. And the standard tomb type in pre-dynastic Egypt and for many centuries following Narmer was something called the mastaba. And the mastaba comes from the Arabic word for bench. And the mastaba refers to a rectangular tomb made of stone or mud-baked brick with sloping sides, erected above an underground chamber. The mastaba is the tomb of one single individual, usually, and the mastaba has an above ground and an underground component. If we look at this diagram, we can see that the above ground portion of the mastaba within its sloping sides contains something called a serdab. And the serdab is this room. The serdab is a small sealed room inside the mastaba that houses the Ka statue, as well as functioning as a sort of chapel or collective space for the objects that relatives believed the deceased individual would need in the afterlife. That's why there's an offering table where objects that an individual might need in the Egyptian vision of an afterlife would be placed. The Ka, within Egyptian understanding, was the life force or spirit of the deceased. It was the life force or the spirit of the deceased. And the Ka could be mobile, it could roam, it could leave the tomb and return to it. So a vertical shaft often connected the serdab to the outside or the mastaba to the outside. So here we have a vertical shaft, or like a tunnel that would be sealed off once the body was positioned in the tomb. The actual body of the deceased rested in a sarcophagus or stone coffin in an underground burial chamber. And this is the subterranean portion of the tomb. There would be a burial chamber, and the body would be contained in a sarcophagus or a type of stone, usually stone, coffin. Depending on the wealth of the individual, sometimes there would be intentional blockages made using rubble or stones to try and keep the body of the deceased person undisturbed from tomb robbers, which is why there are those blockages there. And the serdab and the entirety of the mastaba would be sealed once the internment or placement of the sarcophagus was complete. Now, very often, and somewhat related to the wealth of the individual being buried inside a mastaba, you can find elaborately carved and painted imagery decorating these tombs. This is a painting from a wall in the mastaba of a government official named T. So he's a government official, meaning he is essentially part of the aristocracy. He's part of the elite. He's not a commoner. He's a man of high position and of wealth. T is shown here supervising a hippopotamus hunt, hence the title, T watching a hippopotamus hunt, on the Nile. And the artist has used both hieratic scale and composite view to differentiate him from the other people who accompany him on the hunt. Because he is a member of the elite, he is essentially supervising the hunt. And here we have a crowd of 4 individuals who are shown in action, raising their, what would that be called? I want to say harpoon, but that's for a whale. I'll go with harpoon, or weapon, raising their weapons above their heads, ready to throw them into the river or to stab a hippopotamus or try to. Obviously, this is a very dangerous type of hunt. And the river is depicted as a band of blue. And you can see that it teems with life. There are all sorts of fish, as well as hippopotamus, who are compressed into this horizontal band, again emphasizing the abundance of the Nile and its life-giving nature. One of the first truly grandiose royal tombs built for a pharaoh or king is the stepped pyramid of Djoser, of the third dynasty, and it stands in Saqqara, an ancient necropolis or city of the dead for the city of Memphis. The stepped pyramid was overseen by Imhotep during its construction. Imhotep was the vizier of the pharaoh Djoser, and the vizier is sort of like the second in command, like the closest person to the pharaoh. Imhotep would not be an architect in the traditional sense, but he very likely oversaw the large workforce that was required to make this structure, which could very well have taken decades to complete. The stepped pyramid is 200 feet high at a minimum, and you can see that the contour of the pyramid, its form is made of a series of mastabas of diminishing size that are stacked one on top of the other. That's why it looks like a staircase. The purpose of the tomb was to protect the body of the pharaoh after death, and the body of the pharaoh at this point would have been mummified. The purpose of the tomb was also to symbolize, through its massive size, the absolute monumental power of the king or pharaoh. And the third purpose of the tomb to be constructed was to serve as the abode of the Ka, the life force or spirit of the deceased. Now, once again, during this moment in ancient Egyptian religion, the Ka lived on after the death of the physical body, and it was forever engaged in activities. An ancient necropolis or city of the dead for the city of Memphis. The stepped pyramid was overseen by Imhotep during its construction. Imhotep was the vizier of the pharaoh Djoser, and the vizier is sort of like the second in command, like the closest person to the pharaoh. Imhotep would not be an architect in the traditional sense, but he very likely oversaw the large workforce that was required to make this structure, which could very well have taken decades to complete. The stepped pyramid is 200 feet high at a minimum, and you can see that the contour of the pyramid, its form is made of a series of mastabas of diminishing size that are stacked one on top of the other. That's why it looks like a staircase. The purpose of the tomb was to protect the body of the pharaoh after death, and the body of the pharaoh at this point would have been mummified. The purpose of the tomb was also to symbolize, through its massive size, the absolute monumental power of the king or pharaoh. And the third purpose of the tomb to be constructed was to serve as the abode of the Ka, the life force or spirit of the deceased. And the vizier is sort of like the second in command, diminishing size that are stacked one on top of the other. That's why it looks like a staircase. The purpose of the tomb was to protect the body of the pharaoh after death, and the body of the pharaoh at this point would have been mummified. The purpose of the tomb was also to symbolize, through its massive size, the absolute monumental power of the king or pharaoh. And the third purpose of the tomb to be constructed was to serve as the abode of the Ka, the life force or spirit of the deceased. Now, once again, during this moment in ancient Egyptian religion, the Ka lived on after the death of the physical body, and it was forever engaged in activities that it had enjoyed in its former earthly life. But in the absence of a living body, the Ka resided in a sculpted likeness of the deceased. The Ka resided in a sculpted likeness of the deceased, or a Ka statue. It is this need to meet the requirements of the Ka that first prompted the development of elaborate funerary rites and elaborate funerary complexes for the pharaohs, who were believed to continue to live a kingly existence after death. And so here, at the base of the stepped pyramid, there are these little openings on the exterior to the serdab, the chamber inside where the Ka statue sat. And if you look through these little holes, you can see the Ka statue of Djoser here. Now, in addition to the Ka statue, monumental tomb complexes and other types of architectural complexes were usually filled with statues of the pharaohs. And this is a statue of Khafre enthroned, and it comes from Giza, and it dates to about 2520 BCE. This particular statue is made of diorite, just like the votive statue of Judea. And the purpose of the tomb was also to symbolize, through its massive size, the absolute monumental power of the king or pharaoh. And the third person is made of a series of mastabas of diminishing size that are stacked one on top of the other. That's why it looks like a staircase. The purpose of the tomb was to protect the body of the pharaoh after death, and the body of the pharaoh at this point would have been mummified. The purpose of the tomb was also to symbolize, through its massive size, the absolute monumental power of the king or pharaoh. And the third purpose of the tomb to be constructed was to serve as the abode of the Ka, the life force or spirit of the deceased. And the third purpose of the tomb to be constructed was to serve as the abode of the Ka, the life force or spirit of the deceased. Now, once again, during this moment in ancient Egyptian religion, the Ka lived on after the death of the physical body, and it was forever engaged in activities that it had enjoyed in its former earthly life. But in the absence of a living body, the Ka resided in a sculpted likeness of the deceased. The Ka resided in a sculpted likeness of the deceased, or a Ka statue. It is this need to meet the requirements of the Ka that first prompted the development of elaborate funerary rites and elaborate funerary complexes for the pharaohs, who were believed to continue to live a kingly existence after death. And so here, at the base of the stepped pyramid, there are these little openings on the exterior to the serdab, the chamber inside where the Ka statue sat. And if you look through these little holes, you can see the Ka statue of Djoser here. Now, in addition to the Ka statue, monumental tomb complex, other types of art, there are these little openings on the exterior to the serdab, the chamber inside where the Ka statue sat. And if you look through these little holes, you can see the Ka statue of Djoser here. Now, in addition to the Ka statue, monumental tomb complexes and other types of architectural complexes were usually filled with statues of the pharaohs. And this is a statue of Khafre enthroned, and it comes from Giza, and it dates to about 2520 BCE. This particular statue is made of diorite, just like the votive statue of Judea was that we saw last week in Mesopotamia, that hard green stone statue. Monumental tomb complexes and other types of architectural complexes were usually filled with statues of the pharaohs. And this is a statue of Khafre enthroned, and it comes from Giza, and it dates to about 2520 BCE. This particular statue is made of diorite, just like the votive statue of Judea was that we saw last week in Mesopotamia, that hard green stone. And this is one of many oversized statues made for the Valley Temple of Khafre. And before I continue, I'm just going to criticize myself. I've called this the portrait statue of Khafre, and I might just call it statue of Khafre or Khafre enthroned, because it's not a portrait in the modern sense, how we use the term portrait. It's not a documentary likeness of the individual ruler. It is a representation of him and his kingship. It is more a representation of his office than it is of his actual face. Because how he is represented is governed by certain conventions. The notion that a portrait of someone is a documentary likeness that captures every idiosyncratic element of someone's face is actually a very contemporary notion. But before I continue, I want you to take a moment to just look at this statue and ask yourself the question, what about this statue captures Egyptian artistic conventions? What I mean by that is, when you look at this statue, you automatically know that it's Egyptian and that it's a pharaoh. So why is that? What factors, what communicates the fact that it's an Egyptian pharaoh? Take a moment to make a list and jot down some points before you continue on with this video. So again, I want you to pause this video and I want you to make a quick list as you look at it. What are some of the elements that make you automatically recognize that this is an Egyptian pharaoh? Pause the video, make the list, and then hit play again. Have you made the list? No, really, pause the video, make a quick list, and just look for a couple minutes. Okay, so let's break this down. We can see that Khafre sits on a throne, and it's a lion throne. You can see that each leg of the throne ends in this sort of claw. And We can see that the sides of the throne are also ornamented with intertwined lotus and papyrus plants, which are both symbols of the united Egypt. Khafre sits on the throne in a very authoritative pose, but his status as pharaoh is also communicated through his clothing. He wears a beard. He wears the shundit, the kilt. He wears an elaborate headdress, a traditional linen nemes headdress, which covers his forehead and falls in pleated folds over his shoulders. He clearly originally held something in this hand that no longer survives, while the other palm rests on his knee. If we look more closely at the sides of the sculpture, we can see that the falcon, representative of the Egyptian god Horus, or hawk, I'm still unsure there, we can see how the wings of the hawk or falcon come forward to frame the face of Khafre and to initiate the pleats of the linen headdress he wears. So the representation of the god in animal form or zoomorphic form is right behind his head. And here on the side of the throne, you can see the carving of intertwined lotus and papyrus plants in stylized form that represent the united Egypt. Now, the semi-divine nature of the status of the pharaoh is again reinforced through the style of the carving. Overall, the statue is highly idealized. I'm not saying there aren't moments of naturalism, because there are. But again, the statue is not intended to capture a documentary likeness of Khafre's individual features, but to represent the idea or ideal of Egyptian kingship through, in part, the erasure of figural or facial flaws or distinguishing features. Khafre has no warts, he has no wrinkles, he doesn't have bushy eyebrows. He is shown at the height of health, strength, and youth. And he may or may not have looked like this figure. The artist would not have understood the portrait as requiring a recognizable likeness of Khafre in its execution. So the artist would be free to idealize his depiction and to erase or adapt anything that was seen to detract from the representation of his office, meaning his status as king, in his biological face. The seated figure is also very compact and solid, with few projecting or breakable parts. The arms are held close to the torso on the lap, and the calves rest against the front of the throne. The feet are sort of equidistant or equally spaced apart, and the head stares fixedly forward. He does not look at the viewer. The gaze of the pharaoh looks beyond the viewer at something unknown in the distance. And that lack of access to his vision, to his gaze, also underscores his supreme authority and semi-divine nature. The pose is frontal, rigid, and bilaterally symmetrical. And by bilaterally symmetrical, I just mean that the figure of Khafre is almost identical on both sides. If you were to draw an imaginary line down his seated figure, there's almost no variation between the left and right sides of his body, with the exception of his hands. So he's identical on either side. This block-like appearance may reflect the fact that Caufrey is sculpted in diorite, a very, very hard stone, using a subtractive method, meaning that the sculptor cut or chiseled away chunks of stone. But this sort of the symmetry and the frontal position and the unwavering gaze and the compact position of the body all convey a sense of solidity, of stability, of an office that cannot be challenged, of a supreme authority. Now, before I continue with the rest of the lecture, I'm going to introduce a new term, and this term is called iconography. An iconography involves identifying and to a certain degree studying the content or subject matter and the conventional symbols or motifs in works of art. The word iconography comes from the Greek. It combines the words icon and graphia. So literally it means image writing. But the term iconography is something that you will find probably in your textbook and in other art historical texts. And again, it involves identifying and studying the content or subject matter of works of art and any conventional symbols in works of art. It refers to content, not style. So what is depicted, not how it's depicted. Content, not style. What's depicted, not how it's depicted. However, style or stylistic elements often work together with the content or subject matter of a work of art to convey a specific mood or message. And the idea here is that a particular art historical period or a particular geographical region or a particular culture will use a shared repertoire of iconographic symbols. And if you, as a scholar, or a baby scholar, since this is your first art history class more likely, identifying symbolic meanings consistently and learning to recognize iconographic symbols from a specific time period help us to identify meanings that may seem less obvious to us as modern viewers, but which were very blatant to the historical viewer. So let's take a look at the iconographic symbols in this statue of Caufrey. In no particular order, the content of this statue that communicates his kingship includes the Nemes linen headdress. It's this characteristic headdress that falls in horizontal pleats of linen. Now I've called it an eagle. Okay, the bird-like creature that represents Horus, whether it's a falcon or a hawk. The fact that Caufrey has a beard. And fun fact, if you look very closely, there's a line down his cheek on the left and the right. That's because the pharaohs all wore like a fake beard rather than a natural one that could be shaped using wax and probably wires to create a particular type of beard that's identifiable. So he wears a fake beard. The pleated kilt, or shundite. He would have been holding a baton or a scepter or something indicative of his status as pharaoh. The intertwined lotus and papyri blossoms, they're stylized. You could also add the fact that he's barefoot. All of these are iconographic symbols or part of the iconography of this statue that, together with the style of its depiction, create the overall mood of authority or the message of the statue, which is to reinforce the absolute kingship of Khafre.